Welcome. Can everyone hear? Just wave your hand if you can hear. Yeah, great. We're going to get started, and I know there's a lot of folks signed up for the webinar today, and we just will let them come as they come. But my name is Katie Smith-Milway. I am with the Executive Committee of Endeavor, and we are the Global Impact Network for INSEAD alumni. And we care about raising awareness and advocacy for sustainable work and life, both social impact and environmental impact. We collaborate very closely with the Community Impact Challenge, which is a real action arm for all alumni in terms of how we can make changes in the way we work and live. So both organizations are collaborating on this. We have a terrific panel of experts on the food crisis today, both the problem and solutions. And without further ado, we're going to get started in a second. I would love folks, though, to just go onto the chat and say your name and how you connect to food crisis or why you were interested in joining today. Because I know we have a lot of experts in the audience, and we're going to reserve about half the time for dialogue and questions. And so, and you can put your questions in the chat as well. But let's start off with just, folks introducing themselves to each other in the chat and what their connection is to the issue. Our panel is going to start with Robin Millington. She's the CEO of Planet Tracker, which makes its business to, well, I'm going to let Robin actually introduce herself. She's just come off Climate Week at the UN, and she's got a lot to share. So let me throw our slides up, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Katie. Right. I'm Robin Millington, and the organization I run is Planet Tracker. For any of you who've been in the climate change space for very long, I'm sure you're familiar with Carbon Tracker. Carbon Tracker created the narrative around stranded assets in the oil and gas industry. We then, in 2018, decided that we really needed to include biodiversity and issues beyond just carbon emissions. So Planet Tracker was formed. We're a group of financial people with some data experts and a few environmental experts. And we are looking at this from the view of the investment and what money is driving the system and how is it driving the system and how can it actually drive the system in a positive direction. So that's Planet Tracker. I was asked by Katie to just set up a little bit of the issue or the work that we are looking at. So one of the things that I get very frustrated with is that everybody talks about Ukraine, and it's all Ukraine and the wheat downturn and the oil downturn, the food oil downturn and the oil prices. Yes, the Ukraine war has been a black swan, but in the background of all of that, we've been crashing through tipping points in the last 2 or 3 years that are climate induced. And this first slide is just very quickly to take us through, just giving you some examples of where problems are happening. And Katie, if you could go, yeah, Spain has had a huge drought. They're down significantly in olive oil, wheat, and barley production. Morocco is down on 2022, 52%. In wheat, it's 17% down this year. Italy has had the worst drought in 70 years, and then they had all those floods. So their wheat, maize, rice, tomato production is down. The Horn of Africa, of course, is in the grips of a horrible drought. And of course, many people are acutely food insecure there. And just a point to make on that, if there's no water, there's no water. People move and immigrate because of these things. Iraq has political problems, and it's also in the grips of drought. And the wheat production there is down. Wheat production is down in places like Syria. Keep going, Katie. And China has had rice production go down. And since this slide, we should have put in that they had the worst floods in 140 years, which are also taking production down. India has now put bans on wheat, sugar, and rice exports to protect its domestic market, which is partly government driven. They've got elections coming up. They're trying to protect the prices for their population. Vietnam has put bans on more rice exports. Argentina the large soy producer in the world, has had the worst drought in 60 years. So it is not all the Ukraine war. We have water stress, and not even mentioned in this slide, and I should have put it in, is the whole 20-year drought going on in California. California produces 50% of the US food. So the framing on this is that climate change is leading us towards some really new territory that I'm not sure the markets have priced in properly yet. You look at the commodity pricing through 2024, it's showing everything is still going up gradually, not huge amounts, but food production is going up. But if you're looking at the climate models and realizing that we've had an unprecedented climate experience with a La Nina, which is supposed to be the cooling period in the Pacific, having a 3-year run and ending with the highest sea surface temperatures. I mean, the sea surface around Florida was the temperature of a hot tub, and the sea surface around Scotland, and et cetera, et cetera. And we've gone into an El Nino, which takes the sea surface temperatures even higher. We don't know where this is going now. And I must say, I'm talking to a lot of scientists, and they're all saying, well, the climate models predicted this, but we didn't quite expect it this fast and this intense. So we at Planet Tracker have come up with what we call the financial markets roadmap for transforming the global food system. And this is aimed very much at the financial community who is putting the money into business as usual that we have today. Next. So I don't know the level of expertise on the call. For those of you that are not as familiar with the food system, and we've all been so focused on net zero, and yet we have this looming other global system that has, yes, it's being driven by climate change. And I hear people say, oh, if we just solve for climate change, it'll be fine. No, that's not true. We have unabated fishing on the high seas and illegal fishing in economic zones. We have lots of inefficiencies in the current system. We have soil breakdown going on. There is more going on in the food system than just the impacts of climate change. And food is responsible, yes, for 35% of the carbon emissions. It's responsible for species decline of up to 86%. It's responsible for biodiversity decline of 70% in the last 50 years. The currently fish stocks, the commercial fish stocks, 35% are overfished, up to 90% are teetering on the edge right now. And I'm not kidding when I say teetering on the edge. We are really facing a crisis. And seafood actually feeds 3 billion people in the world as their primary protein. So we have to get a hold of that. The good news coming out of New York is that the UN finally signed the High Seas Treaty, which is a huge step in a great direction. And I'm really happy to hear that. The other thing coming out of New York is that the upcoming COP, the Climate Conference of Parties for the Climate Change Conference, has added food in as an official food day. So we are now getting somewhere politically at last with some of the issues that are underlying the food system. Just to finish, food loss and waste, if you're an investor, if you've invested in food systems, you're losing a third of your investment, not to mention the food that could be on people's tables. But that's a different issue, and I'll let Maria talk to that. Next. We believe that there are 6 priority actions that investors and lenders, the finance community, can take today. You don't have to wait until 2030, and you certainly can't wait until 2050. And very quickly, we feel that fully traceable supply chains is one of the key issues, because a lot of the major ag companies or the distributors or retailers, the production traders, they say we don't own our supply chain, so it's not our problem. And I've heard that once too often. I've lost patience with it. If we we've shown that putting traceability systems in place actually creates greater profitability. And we have several papers on that. Please dive into our website and take a look at that. Philippe will be talking to one of the wonderful ideas that's out there for tracing supply chains. I've talked to food loss and waste, stopping deforestation. The EU due diligence directive that's come out has said that it will not allow imported deforestation going forward. Now, I think that is a huge step forward and something very important. Where the EU goes, often the rest of the world has to go. If you recall, a decade ago, when the EU tightened emission standards on cars, it meant if you were in the US, if you were in South Korea or in Japan, you had to tighten your emission standards. So we're hoping that the deforestation directive will have an impact on the supply chains. Methane or methane, potato, however you pronounce it, cutting emissions, that's a quick win because those are quick emissions to get out of the environment. So a large amount of agricultural methane could be dealt with within the next few years if the political and business will is there. Regenerative agriculture is a no-brainer. It is so important for the agricultural system. A very quick example, there was a hurricane that hit Southern California about a month ago. One of the wine growers there had taken half of his fields over to regenerative processes. He hadn't yet taken the other half of his fields, which were based on chemicals and fertilizers, over to the regenerative standards. The fields that weren't regenerative were wiped out. The regenerative fields actually survived. So that's a small anecdote, but I think it's a wonderful example of how regenerative agriculture has many, many benefits. James and Philippe will both be talking to that in a few minutes. And then we also think that investment in alternative protein production is very important. These are all investable concepts that are available now. Investors can do these things. We also think, looking at food, there's not a real stranded asset play in this, except for beef. And the more we look at beef and try and figure it all out, the more we see beef as being the potential stranded asset in the space. And therefore, if you are going to take beef out, alternative proteins is a way of looking at this as well. Next. So just a very quick illustration is quick wins, investable wins from the investment community. You can get GHG reductions now in the coming period of at least 20% by doing various things with the regen ag, by cutting food loss and waste. This does not have to wait until 2050. And I'm getting very frustrated as I go into some of the meetings and I hear the talk about, well, we're setting targets to 2050. A lot of this is doable within the next 10 years. Our biggest worry about food security and production of food that will be available through the changes that climate change is bringing is that the 2030 to 2040 period is at risk if we don't do the investments today. But we can do those investments today. Very quickly, we've done a lot of work on deforestation in Brazil, particularly. One of the things we've discovered is that deforestation isn't just about, okay, we've taken down some trees and they're not absorbing carbon. It has a whole feedback loop to the sovereign health of a nation, to the treasury of a sovereign country. And changing rainfall patterns means that in many areas you can no longer double crop. So you can't get 2 crops a year. You can only get 1 crop a year. That impacts the revenues from exports. It impacts food security within the country, and it also impacts taxes and tax revenues into the treasury. It also, with declining water, the changing rainfall patterns mean you can't produce the hydropower at the levels. And I think many of you, depending on if you live in Spain, if you live in California, we've seen the impact of these droughts on hydropower production. It's not just in Brazil, but the feedback loop of the deforestation is going to also create problems with energy production. And then from a social point of view, the extreme heat days, how can workers go out and work as the heat is increasing and increasing? We've seen already this year impacts. Let's look at Phoenix in Arizona. They've had, I don't know how many days of over 115 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a wonderful chart that shows at a certain point you can't work out over a certain number of degrees. At a certain point, it's the death zone. And we're beginning in many of these areas to get into that can't work zone and coming up to the death zone. Very quickly as well, agrimethane is a quick win. In the study that we did on agrimethane called Hot Money, you see it here, we looked at the 20 investors and 20 banks that are funding, if you will, much of what we would call the methane footprint. And what we would like is for those institutions to actually implement methane policies. And we believe that that's something that can be done. And I know that CO2 equivalents can be considered as methane policies, but in our discussions with some of these institutions, they don't look at it like that. If we're going to get methane out, we need to make it a focus and make it clear. Quickly, the food work that we've done for investors, we've encompassed 400,000 companies, and it represents somewhere roughly between 50 to 70% of the system total. Fewer than 4,000 listed companies, that's 0.001% of the global food system total, account for half of the value and a quarter of the revenues. So talk about an oligopoly or concentration, as they say in finance. We have certain key lever points that we can address within the food system of these large players. They're the ones making the big revenues. They're the ones getting the margins in the system. And they can also start helping the transition in the system. This is a chart very quickly that we've broken down and laid out as you might look at it from a financial analyst point of view. I'm not saying that this is the best chart for everyone, but it's how we are presenting it to the analyst community. Very quickly, also, we keep hearing things like implementing traceability systems costs money. But we've done several studies. Please, again, look at our website where we show, in fact, you get a return on that within less than 15 or 16 months. You can make money and profit on it in the longer term. And then we've shown how in different studies we're doing that investment into all these different issues that we're highlighting actually is profitable. And I'm tired of hearing some people tell me it's going to cost us money. It's going to be too much money. It's not. If you invest in these changes now, it can actually lead to profitability. This is the kind of key point. We talk here about transition, and we have to do transition. The key point of this and the following chart are the biggest harms are in the upstream, in the producer end. And that's people that have very thin margins. It's the small farmers, it's the farmers that are feeding into the collectives, and et cetera, et cetera. The least impact, the green area, is on retail, where the biggest margins are being made. And the final slide is the margins and profits. The retailers are making the largest profits, followed very closely by manufacturers, distributors. Who makes the profit? Who pays for transition? Because the small farmers that are on thin margins aren't going to be able to pay for transition. And I will call out a company, I know it's controversial, like Nestle, who is doing that regenerative transition of its 600,000 suppliers. And I would like to say, if they hold to their commitment of 2030, that would be a fantastic sea change in the way those small farmers are able to address transition. So with that said, I'm sure I saw there was a lot of chat. I'm assuming there'll be a lot of questions over to all of you.
Thank you so much, Robin. If you would look through the chat and see if there's some questions that you'd like to answer when we finish going through the presentations, we'll loop back and we'll start doing the questions. Now we're going to move to, you saw that one of the biggest chunks of Robin's presentation was the, sorry, I'm getting stuck on the slide here. There we go. Was the regenerative, one of the biggest profit sort of upsides is regenerative agriculture. And so we've got two INSEAD alum, and Robin's an INSEAD alum from the MBA program who also was on staff at INSEAD. We have two more INSEAD alums who are working on regenerative agriculture, different aspects, one in engineered solution, one in nature-based. And so we're going to look at some things that we can actually do and that organizations are doing. So I'm going to shift the baton to James Stewart from Australia, and he's going to talk to us about Always Carbon and the biochar solution for agriculture.
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, Robin, for setting the scene so powerfully. Good day from Sydney. My name is James Stewart. I'm the CEO of Always Carbon. We specialize in turning waste plant biomass, usually at an agricultural processor or a food processing site, into charcoal. The key here is that the charcoal we're making is called biochar, and it has some very special properties. In particular, it's been heavily researched for the last sort of 30 years or so. The search I did last night, funny enough, showed up almost 400,000 academic papers on Google Scholar that mention biochar in some way. Pretty much any feedstock has been investigated in any agricultural use case you can think of, and a lot of non-agricultural use cases as well. So we tend to find that people are getting excited about putting biochar into concrete to cut emissions and consumption of a heavy CO2 producing material. But the key in this context is that biochar, when applied correctly to soils under direction of an agronomist, does several magical things and is sometimes referred to as black gold for these reasons. It basically holds water in the soil. It's a form of charcoal. It's very porous. If you could just go back one, I'll just work through those. Thank you. It holds water in the soil due to its porous structure, which of course makes irrigation in arid regions and increasingly arid regions in Southwest US and Australia, for example, and Africa, much more effective. It holds nutrients in the soil. So if you are applying a mineral fertilizer, like a nitrate fertilizer or a compost even, it makes it much more effective. And of course, it provides a habitat for microbiome. That leads to a productivity increase, which, seeing as you're using a waste material to boost your output, is a wonderful thing to see. And of course, there is increasing body of research around cutting methane from ruminants such as cattle by including in animal feed. So if you go to the next slide. I've mentioned some of these other uses. These are some pictures of charcoal. It comes in many different types. Depends a little bit on what you're feeding into the pyrolysis machine. Pyrolysis is basically very high temperatures, 500 centigrades or more, and very low oxygen. So the material doesn't burn, but all the hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen is driven away from the material. The point for us as a company is that there is a way of implementing this off-the-shelf technology immediately in a way that is profitable for our operating partners. So if there is a food waste processor, or sorry, a food processor with a waste pile somewhere in your world, call us up, because we have a solution today using off-the-shelf machines that generates a new revenue stream for them. So the doom and gloom around climate change is very well founded, frankly. We need folks to grasp onto the profit motive and move as fast as possible. And that is what we are doing in the solution we provide. So we use off-the-shelf pyrolysis ovens, basically sourced from China or other low-cost locations such as India or Malaysia. They are used currently to make charcoal for fuel. The only thing that we require is that they follow spec and do not set fire to the biochar that is made. It can be used as a fuel source. It can be used as a drop-in replacement for metallurgical coal. But the use cases that we care about are for permanent carbon removal from the atmosphere. And that means that the biochar has to be actually placed back into soil, into a permanent usage other than combustion. Next slide, please. So the key here really is that the carbon cycle gets interrupted. So we take the carbon when it's concentrated in solid form in the form of plant tissues, things like nutshells, sawdust from sustainable sawmills, rice husks from threshing operations. So it's complementary to food production. It doesn't supplant food production, which is important given we've got a lot of people to feed and a lot of poor people who are struggling on cost of food. And by pyrolyzing the material, we can generate energy and replace natural gas use on site, which is very valuable for some markets, including Australia. And the biochar accumulates as a solid form. If it's produced correctly to spec, which we do, then it is a stable form of carbon for about 800 to 900 years or more. We are exclusively working with Puro.Earth, which is part of the NASDAQ group, and we only do permanent carbon removals. So we are an engineered solution. There's no estimation. We weigh the product and we use lab tests to establish the amount of carbon that we've locked up. Next slide, please.
Sorry.
So I'd love to say that this is whizzy off-the-shelf Star Trek tech. It isn't. These are big ovens. This is one of many that I pulled off Alibaba. Suppliers are all over the place. The key is not the equipment in our business model. The key is how you use it and the business model that incentivizes our operating partners to do as much carbon removal and to use that biochar for their own agricultural operations and productivity increase as fast as possible and go to maximum scale. So we will work with any and all equipment manufacturers. This is just a little bit of a sense of the market. Sometimes people worry that the carbon markets are ephemeral or that our buyers are going to disappear. I'm very happy to say that the work has been done by people in the finance sector to line up very large amounts of capital from some of the world's biggest corporations. And for those who are familiar with science-based targets, which I think are a very rigorous standard of corporations dating their climate goals, they can only use removal credits to meet their obligations. If they are going to use offsetting after they've already reduced their footprint, they have to use solutions like the carbon credits that we're issuing. The carbon dioxide removal price, as you see on the left here, does fluctuate, but the trend is definitely upward. We have an idea of what we think the carbon price will be in decades to come. My suggestion is that you should probably come and talk to us about generating carbon credits for yourselves now, because we think the price is going to go up. In a nutshell. I think that is plenty from me.
Okay.
So if
well,
you see waste
James.
biomass, give us a shout.
Yeah, so that's just a terrific example of a place we can invest to spur regenerative agriculture, which is biochar, an engineered solution. Philippe Danger, another MBA alum from INSEAD, is going to talk about a biodiversity solution. So let's move onward to you, Philippe, and please tell people about what you do.
Yes, hello everyone. So yeah, Philippe Dongier, I graduated from INSEAD in 1993, so a few years ago. I currently lead an international NGO called SECI, which works on climate resilience and women's empowerment in some of the most conflict-affected and high climate change impact and high poverty levels in the world, including Sahel countries of West Africa, Haiti, and many others. Before doing this work, I was with GE in Africa, and before that with the World Bank for close to 20 years. And just after INSEAD, I spent 5 years at McKinsey. But my interest for social inclusion and sustainability took me to this career. So very happy to speak with you today about this topic. Now, as we know, we have a big food crisis right now, and this chart from IMF really shows how we basically moved back to where we were in the early 2000s with a number of people living in hunger. So this is, more than 800 million people now in food insecurity. And the bulk of these number is really in Africa. And I want to talk about, the challenge of food production in Africa and the challenge of biodiversity and how to address these and why that matters. So Africa, is where we're going to have the bulk of population growth in the next 30 to 40 years before the world population stabilizes. We are now at 8 billion. The UN predictions, and there are several, but they all converge around 10 to 11 billion. So, the most cited number is around 10.5 billion by 2075. Now, pretty much all of that population growth will be in Africa, which is the part of the world where, you also have among the highest incidence of poverty. So you're going to need, and you combine that with the food crisis, it's clearly a case where agricultural production will need to expand considerably to get out of the food crisis, to meet the consumption needs of a very fast-growing population, which is going to move out of poverty, we hope, fast. Now, that situation of food system expansion, if you look at history of humanity, it's really one of the main causes of biodiversity loss. I think, as Robin said, 70% of biodiversity was lost between 1970 and now alone. And as we continue to expand food systems, this is going to continue. And as we said, Africa is going to be a part of the world where this is going to be acute. So obviously, it's key for us to think about expanding food systems, expanding agricultural production, but doing it in a way that addresses the issue of biodiversity loss. We have a food crisis, we have a biodiversity crisis, as we know. And this chart shows that the current path, which is the lowest curve, taking us where we don't want to go. Conservation alone, which would stabilize, but if we want to improve biodiversity, we also need to combine conservation action with some sustainable production and consumption patterns. Next slide, please. So Africa, as I said, is one place where biodiversity is going to be really at risk. These are some of the main hotspots. SOCI, the organization I lead, is very active in the West Africa zone. So the Guinean forests, which is one of the large tropical forests of the world, is really at risk because of a lot of the migration that comes there and a lot of the agriculture expansion taking place there. So the countries of that region are keen to find ways to balance better the agriculture expansion, which will come with the biodiversity conservation. Next slide, please. So this is a project we are doing there, which is called Guinean Forest Nature-Based Solutions Project, basically focused on biodiversity data, focused on methods to regenerate habitats, combine agriculture expansion with reforestation, and doing it in a way that's coherent, and tracking it to actually see how it's possible to balance the two, the agriculture expansion and the biodiversity conservation. And for that, if you can go to the next slide, as we all know, to do something of that nature, what's key is to be able to measure objectively. How are we really progressing in terms of biodiversity? So we've looked at different ways to measure. There are some remote sensing technologies and others that are very good. But one which has gained lots of momentum is this system called the International Barcode of Life. It's a global database that's now covering big parts of the world. As you can see, not very much in Africa as yet. And so we are partnering with that consortium out of the University of Guelph in Canada to measure biodiversity quite efficiently. It uses a technology of environmental DNA with barcode, where each species has a DNA which is barcoded. And when you take sample in any particular location, you're able to match your sample with the global database and in seconds determine what's the biodiversity of that sample. And you can see it evolve as you take sample every year. And over time, you potentially can see the evolution in a measurable way, which is key, obviously, if you want to be able to incentivize biodiversity conservation and finance it and develop methods for funding, which is really what we are working on. We're trying to find ways to measure biodiversity, to apply methods that are balancing agricultural expansion with biodiversity conservation around reforestation methods and agroforestry, as I said. And then the big question is, if you want to scale that, how do you fund that at scale? How can large mining companies, how can any large business which has a negative biodiversity impact and who wants to compensate or who wants to contribute, or anyone for that matter who would like to contribute to biodiversity, how can you fund that in an efficient way? So there are now, as you know, a lot of talk and work on carbon credits, but we also now have biodiversity credits. So my organization is not leading on that, but we are looking at ways to link the work being done with financing mechanisms to incentivize. So there are a number of countries where these are being done. It's still early stage, but I suggest you keep your eye on that space, because probably it will become much more important as the world becomes more aware of the biodiversity crisis, and as you know, people need to find ways to fund it. So it's basically, the idea is very simple: is you buy a credit, which is a unit of biodiversity conservation. Now, of course, the question is, what's the price of that unit? And there is not yet stability on that question. It's more the pilot stage, but I think we're going to see a lot of work on that very soon. So just encouraging you to watch this space, and thank you for listening to this. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Philippe. And please do put questions for Philippe in the chat, and he will also pick a couple to respond to, and we'll have some dialogue after this. We're going to just close out sort of the information component of this by looking at what's going on.
Katie, I think you're on mute.
Yeah, Katie, we lost you.
Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Well, I was saying thank you to Philippe, and then I wanted to say that one of the things that we're going to be doing with Endeavor is always connecting the global issues we talk about to what's going on at INSEAD, and then things we can do in our own lives and at work. And so this last sort of information segment is from Maria Fedorova from INSEAD, who's been very instrumental in INSEAD's own climate journey. Some of you will have heard that there's sort of three stages of climate change mitigation: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 actions. And scope 1 would be things like, what we eat, do we eat the beef, or do we go for fish, or do we go veg? Scope 2 would be related to service providers that we have more direct control of, such as how we heat. And, do we choose a service provider that has green energy, or a service provider that is using brown energy? But those are things largely within our control. And INSEAD has been addressing a lot of the issues that are within their control, within scope 1 and 2. But scope 3 is, as Robin was explaining, way down the supply chain. It's things that you do, but that other providers really, and manufacturers, et cetera, have control over. And the trick is, how do you influence those carbon polluters that are critical to the way you go about life and business, but you don't really have direct control. So Maria is going to get into how INSEAD's coping on the food front with scope 3. Go ahead, Maria.
Thank you, Katie, so much for having me here. And thank you, Robin, James, and Philippe, for these excellent presentations. And I just wanted to say thank you to Robin for saying that we don't have to wait till 2020 to make an action, that there are a lot of things that we can do now. And again, thank you, Katie, once again, to set the scene about what is scope 3 and what it includes, because we need to understand that the measurement is based on a lot of estimation, and INSEAD has little control, as many organizations, over much of these emissions. So the options are difficult to find. So reducing scope 3 emissions can only be achieved through significant behavioral, technical, and business changes. So the slide you are looking at right now is about the process. So throughout INSEAD Climate Journey, which is the official name of scope 3 project that we've been working on for the past year with a big team, and we have 2 alumni on our team, we follow the same process as in scope 1 and 2. But scope 3 is much more difficult, as I said. So the objective of this stage of the project was to develop a broadly consulted point of view of the risk, the impact, and the opportunity. So this is the overview of all INSEAD emissions. And for most organizations, scope 1 and 2 emissions are the much smaller part of the contribution to the climate change. And this is no different for INSEAD. So our scope 3 emissions are 96% of our total emissions, and this includes 87% of INSEAD emissions due to travel and commuting done by students, participants, and for alumni events. And also, of course, emissions from the food served on campus are part of this scope 3 emissions. So if we can go to the next slide, please. Food as an emission factor is only 2% of INSEAD's total emission, because every organization is different, but it doesn't mean that it's not important for INSEAD to mitigate these emissions. So, for example, if you look at at this chart here on the right, animal protein intensive products, mainly beef, but also cheese and other types of meats, account for 26% of emissions categories. So it offers a second main reduction lever. So it means that there is a lot of that we can mitigate there. So steering committee suggested to focus on this lever as we go forward. But how do we mitigate all this? So steering committee identified a selection of potential decarbonization levers. In total, we identified 16. You are looking right now at marginal abatement cost curve. It was modeled using our 2022 carbon estimate. Among the levers related to food, it's in the gray box. It's providing vegetarian meals by default, or engage top suppliers in the emission reduction program. So this would give us a 0.5 reduction in emissions, which is pretty good result. But of course, I must say that a lot of things have already been done thanks to the work of INSEAD campus services. All credits go to them. For example, to give you a few illustrations, since 2017, INSEAD has been collecting bio-waste, and we have data on the amount of compost we have produced. Also, we have full transparency with the providers we work with. For example, we work with Sodexo, and we have access to their carbon footprint report. And on our Asia campus, they offer free culinary workshop, and they have this in-house green roof and gardens, so they can produce their own fruits and vegetables, and that has reduced the cost of transportation. And of course, I saw that there is like Paolo Sanz here. I wanted to mention the Community Impact Challenge around sustainable food habits, which I participated in, and I know that many people at INSEAD participated, so it's a great example of collective action, which united really stakeholders at INSEAD. So just to finish my presentation, I would like to briefly mention what's coming for INSEAD Climate Journey. We're planning to develop and launch a full-scale awareness campaign about Scope 3 emissions. So it's important to know how much we emit, so it will lead to change in behavioral changes. We will continue to measure and we will continue to share this information with our stakeholders, potentially to develop carbon budget, but this will come later. And also the school will establish a sustainability committee, and the role of this committee will be to support the work of the executive committee. I will stop here, but if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you so much. By the way, if people want to go on up into their view and do the speaker view, then you'll always be able to see who is actually speaking at a given time, because I know there's a lot of us on the call. I mean, you can also, if you want to just sort of see everyone, do gallery. But let's thank you so much for this. Has been a terrific plunge into expertise within our alumni community and INSEAD staff on averting the food crisis. We've got experts in the audience as well. So let's hear some questions. I might just call on Brett Rearson, who's the founder of the World Food Program's Global Post-Harvest Loss Center. We saw food waste loss was actually a big opportunity. Brett, do you want to reflect on anything you've just heard and tell us a little bit about some of the things you're doing?
Hi, Katie. Nice to see you again after all of these years. And wow, intriguing to see all of the different things, as well as, and credit to maybe you, or I'm not sure who curated this, but to see Philip's perspectives on the more developing market side is something that I rarely see when anyone gets into an investment conversation. I see more the kind of intriguing possibilities that James is doing. The work that I'm doing, I was the country director for the World Food Program in China and dealt with the massive food loss and waste issues there. And then was asked to come to Uganda to set up the Global Center for Post-Harvest Knowledge and Operations. And in that, we ended up reaching about 1 million families in 26 countries, which sounds great at first glance until you realize that our guesstimate is 180 million to 200 million smallholder families in Africa. Where the World Bank gets 50 million smallholder farmers from, I really have no idea. And then recently kind of left the UN and then went back towards the private sector, where the major companies that are dealing with safe food storage have asked me to launch a new trade association, Global Alliance for Safe Food Storage. It's at the safefoodstorage.org. And it's literally this week that we're launching. So when the website doesn't completely work, give us a little bit of slack, but it's coming now. But no, for me, it was just that you've hit both sides of food loss and waste. There was, if I can address just one question that someone had asked early in the chat, they were saying, where does 33% come from? I was actually with Carol Afabi from FAO. It's her job to do the impossible, to take absolutely unreliable statistics from many different countries. If you're talking about public health with Hans Rosling, the stats are pretty good. But if you're talking about agricultural production or food loss and waste, they're notoriously bad. And she has to massage these different figures and come up with some kind of a number that is politically feasible. And I was with the people from Bühler Group. It's a huge Swiss company that makes all of the mills. And at almost every point of the food process, so through the value chain, we estimate minimum for grains of a 40% loss in most of the markets across Africa, across the 56 countries. The stats are way, way higher than a third, and that's before the food even leaves the farm gate. And then if you listen to Bühler and what they're doing in terms of the processing, they're estimating that the food that gets to them, there's another 20%. So the fact that people throw around this 33% number, and it's a drastic understatement. And that's been empirically shown again and again, but it's not politically acceptable to say that it's any higher than that. So anyway, I'm sure there's other questions. Why don't I leave it at that?
Thank you. No, I mean, that's sober. I mean, your information and what we heard from Maria is very sobering. It's great to see shafts of light through James and Philippe's work. I'm wondering if there's other folks on the call who can speak to shafts of light they're seeing in their work. Just feel free to raise your hand or go off mute. We have lots of experts on this call. Robin, maybe I can ask you to tell us to what extent you're seeing some of these nature-based and engineered solutions come up, across planet trackers, looking to corporation, like sort of corporate investment and corporate transition. Are you seeing these rise to the top, or are these kind of NGO efforts?
First define nature-based solutions, because one of the things that we're coming into a space that's very dominated by thinking about climate change, reducing emissions, and there are nature-based solutions for climate change that may solve for emissions but don't necessarily solve for food or nature. So we are always actually in the balance. We've just been contacted by one of the major banks to write a white paper with them on this very issue, is what is a good nature-based solution. So for example, one of the things floating around is how do you capture methane from existing dairy farms and turn that into biogas so that it's not actually, it's a way of trying to mitigate the problem with methane and use it for energy. The flip side of that, or the unexpected consequence, would be if that is priced well, then people will begin opening dairy farms in order to create more methane to be able to sell into the methane market. So how do you choose what a nature-based solution is, and how do you define what a nature-based solution is? It's a bit like Uber, right? You're supposed to share your car, but now they're just buying fleets of cars to run Uber. Would that biogas in the dairies be a solution, or just create a new market? So we're struggling with this at the moment and trying to come up with a good definition and some good case studies and examples as well.
So I just saw Megan Pillsbury, who's a former president of the Student Club Endeavor, talking about how to nature-proof your decarbonization strategy. Do you want to say more about that, Megan? You were at Climate Week as well.
Yeah, sorry, totally caught me off guard. Good morning, everybody. So at Climate Week last week, so I work in the nature risk analytics space, developing a digital platform to help companies measure their nature-related financial risks per the TNFD, if everyone's familiar with that.
No, say it, just spell it out, because not everybody will.
The Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So it's the follow-on for nature, similar to the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is much a buzz these days with the regs from California and hopefully soon the SEC. But it was super interesting at Climate Week because I attended a lot of the like TNFD and nature risk discussions, and many of the companies there were talking about, like Nestle was there talking about working with their the small farmers, and that was very interesting. But there was this expression that I heard about how to nature-proof your decarbonization strategy, because many companies are kind of like, we're working on carbon, we'll get to nature later. But two of the messages that came through is that nature can actually help you meet your decarbonization strategy. And then you don't want to, like the examples that were just given, like come up with a decarbonization strategy that creates negative effects to nature, and then you've got another problem to deal with next year when you decide to focus on nature. So because the two are so intertwined, you really kind of need to address them together. And then look for solutions that create benefits for both, rather than working in a silo on one. That was Compass.
Were there examples of companies that were doing that? Maybe if you might have heard of some. Robin may have some up her sleeve.
Maybe I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
This is the problem. I'm maybe as well. I'm not, you know, until we test out sort of and start doing the stress testing on some of these, I'm just need to see. Like I said, we're doing a white paper with a major bank that should be out at Christmas, and hopefully we'll have some good examples.
Yeah. So Paolo has a question for you, Robin. Paolo Senes, who is the president of the Community Impact Challenge, another INSEAD alum. And he wanted to hear about the productivity of regenerative agriculture versus current agriculture. How does the productivity look, one versus the other? And James may have an insight on that too.
I was
It's
going to say,
better.
James, you probably can.
Let's not mess around. Guys, like this stuff has been incredibly heavily researched. Yes, it's a shift in the farming system. Productivity is, depending on the soil and your current system, cheaper, more robust, more resilient, fewer inputs, less runoff, less energy, and higher output. Is that simple and direct enough? I mean,
So
there's
really no reason not to shift to regenerative, but it's more.
There are barriers.
What are the
There
barriers?
are barriers, not reasons. No, there are barriers. There is status quo. There's education. There's incentives. There's a need to establish a new profit motive to encourage people to shift at scale, not just hobbyists and enthusiasts, but actually the entire system. This is important, difficult work. So there are barriers, but there is no excuse.
But James, that gets to the whole discussion I was having about who pays for transition. And if we are going to transition at scale, we have to have the large ag players at scale putting the money into that transition.
And in our case, I've put a note in the chat. I think it's important to re-emphasize, we've got some fantastic viewpoints and very, very credentialed and experienced people on this call who have a very strong grasp on policy and frameworks that we will need to encourage economy-wide change. However, I would also put the challenge and re-emphasize that these solutions that we are dealing with, that Philippe is dealing with in biodiversity credits, that I'm dealing with in carbon removal, and that you will find across energy, water, biodiversity, carbon, name it, the solutions are here. What we need is people to take action immediately and to stop making excuses and pushing the can down to 2050 and to actually grasp profits that are available now to people who actually are getting ahead of this. They're taking market share, they're cutting their costs, and they're going to have a more resilient system for producing their products and outputs for their markets. So I'm seized with the urgency of the situation, and I'm shocked when I talk to people who are sitting in the status quo companies and are not having these conversations at board level and are not forming a strategy around it. It feels very irresponsible as a director to not discharge your duties around making sure you have a short and medium-term transition plan that is profitable for your company. And it can be done. The examples are everywhere around us. If you have any trouble with that, call any of us and we'll guide you to these solutions that are off the shelf right now.
Paul, Philippe, maybe you can give us the view from the grassroots of the smallholder farmer. Are you seeing them making the transitions?
So, you know, smallholder farmers that's one of the biggest challenges, and there are really great innovations in where you have agribusiness companies who outsource a lot of their work to small farmers and transfer technology, transfer financing, transfer know-how, and help small farmers bring up their productivity and integrate basically the work of the industrial farming with a small farmer. And there is work being done on how then to interest the small farmers in the large business itself by them having a share, for example. So that there are very interesting models of that. And as part of that, there are shifts, of course, to more nature-based approaches. But it's when you work at the individual level, it's extremely fragmented, and that's something that leaders in Africa themselves are saying. You know, they have to find a way to deal with the fragmentation of agriculture, to transfer information, transfer technology, and to make it possible for small farmers to shift to a higher level of productivity and also, you know, more ecological practices.
Wow. Well,
Katie,
listen, go ahead. Yes, someone.
So just to back up what Philippe was saying, what we found was that, you know, for example, we were trying to have farmers deal with aflatoxins, our carcinogenic mold here. And what we found was that if you give them a business case that makes sense for them, I had so many people saying, traditional farmers won't change. These millions of farming families that I referred to, they were not given anything. They made the choice to buy a better future in terms of being able to store their own crops and for them to be able to reduce massive reduction of carbon footprint, but also that they're not concerned about that. They're concerned about food on the table and their ability to feed their families. And that's what we saw. You know, again, if you think of WIFMs and whammies, there was a huge what's in it for me for these farmers to change their behaviors. And it had a massive global positive impact.
That's fantastic. Well, listen, I want to end with two quick points. Sorry, I hear someone trying to get in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. So we are INSEAD, Katie, we are INSEAD West startup, and we are working on restoring the soil health. So regenerative agriculture, working on precision-based soil analysis by next generation sequencing, and then based on those reports and preparing the tailored biofertilizer for the soil. We have talked to farmers, and like there's a huge problem. Their soil is already degraded, and working on it. We and want to know more about the ecosystem in INSEAD, and we are based in London. Thank you so much.
Annie, can you put your information in the chat and then we'll follow up with you? I want to just end the Community Impact Challenge. As you know, if you want to just jump in and do something personally about the food crisis, the Start Now Challenge, you can see the link to the right, is a place that you can plug in and start to take actions. And just 4, if you can, zero in on a few that you can do at work and at home. Reducing meat consumption, we heard about that, and opting for vegetarian. If you do need meat, eat less fish, consume less dairy, try plant-based yogurt alternatives, and if you must, grass-fed beef. And then reducing food waste is just a huge, huge way to help. You heard from Brett, just the travesty of food waste. So, use leftovers and omelets. Use all those terrific French options for using up leftovers, quiche, omelet, stir fry, etc. And then finally, if you can look to fair trade labels to support sustainable, then you can start to influence the scope 3 emissions that Maria was talking to us about, because fair trade is actually vetting the supply chain. So those are just some things that you can do personally coming out of this webinar, to the extent you're feeling motivated, and we hope you are. The other thing we want to say is join the Endeavor Global Impact Network if you're not part of it. You just go to your My INSEAD profile and click on Endeavor under newsletters, and then that makes you a member, and you can join our LinkedIn group as well. There's an open group for people who aren't INSEAD alums, and then there's a INSEAD alum group as well. But if you just go to the Endeavor Global Impact Network on LinkedIn, you'll find us. Final thing I want to leave you with is our small but mighty executive committee that organizes the webinars and our annual sustainability summit, etc., is going to be running elections to add 3 members, and we're specifically looking for someone who will be our liaison for INSEAD's climate journey, someone who will be our liaison for all the national alumni associations that are starting to have sustainability reps. That's a budding network for us. And then finally, someone who wants to be the webinar lead, because I'm the president of the club and I'm also doing webinars, and I'd love a helper on that. So and we do about 4 to 6 a year. We also promote all of the webinars at national alumni associations that are related to sustainability, and global clubs related to sustainability. So that's us. And those are just some opportunities for you to jump in, either to Endeavor and help in a INSEAD wide way, or to just do some things differently at work and home. And I want to thank you all for participating. We're at the top of the hour, so I'll let you get back to work. And, do good things for yourself and the planet. Take care.